Adam Schiff leaned forward, voice steady, words sharp. He thought he had Kennedy cornered, thought the trap was set. "Senator," Schiff said, "maybe if you studied the law a little more carefully, you'd understand what's at stake." The audience chuckled. The camera zoomed. Schiff's smile said it all. This was supposed to be his viral clip. But Kennedy didn't blink. He reached into his folder, flipped open a page, and said in his slow Louisiana drawl, "Congressman, you might want to sit tight because the law you just quoted, those aren't my words. They're yours." The chuckles vanished. Schiff's face tightened. And by the time Kennedy finished reading, the chamber wasn't laughing anymore. It was staring at a career ending in real time. Like and subscribe, because when Schiff tried to play smart, Kennedy played final. Some rooms look safe until the wrong page gets open. The House chamber was built for Schiff. He'd spent years here learning its rhythms, mastering its rules, becoming fluent in the pauses and inflections that made a soundbite travel. This was his stage, his home field, and he was ready to prove it. The press benches were full, cameras humming, reporters waiting for the clash. Schiff had prepped for this, aides whispering behind him, a binder thick with notes, citations, case law, precedents he could wield like a blade. Kennedy, by contrast, carried only a thin folder. No props, no staffers feeding him pages. He sat back, calm, glasses low, as though he hadn't even read the agenda. To Schiff, it looked like overconfidence. To Kennedy, it was muscle memory, because he knew this wasn't about paper. It was about pressure. The chair gavelled the session to order. Schiff launched almost immediately, his voice rising, his tone crisp. "Senator Kennedy, you've twisted constitutional oversight into a partisan game. You parade half-truths as though they were gospel. Maybe if you studied the law a little more carefully, you'd understand what's at stake here." Laughter scattered from Schiff's side of the room. Staffers smirked, cameras cut tight on his face. It was the moment he'd been waiting for. Kennedy, boxed in by ridicule. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't move his shoulders. He just slid a sheet from his folder, square on the desk, and tapped it once with his pen. "Congressman," he said, the drawl stretching every syllable, "you might want to sit tight, because that law you just quoted, that's not my interpretation. That's your own language, written into the record." The laughter broke into silence. Schiff blinked, his smile tightening at the edges. He hadn't expected the trap to spring back on him. And the room leaned forward, waiting. A comeback lands hardest when it comes from the other man's pen. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward dramatically. He simply held the sheet in his hand, the words already highlighted, the dates circled at the top. Reporters craned their necks to see. Staffers leaned sideways, whispering. Schiff, who only moments ago had worn the confident smile of a man in command, suddenly shifted in his seat. "Congressman," Kennedy began, his drawl slow, deliberate, "you just quoted oversight statutes to me as though I've misread them. But let me read something else, something you said on this floor during a hearing 3 years ago." He lowered his glasses, glanced down, and read word for word. "Oversight is not the job of prosecutors. It is the solemn duty of Congress, and anyone who obstructs that process undermines the law itself." The chamber went still. Schiff's own words, carved into the record, were now being read back to him as a charge, not a principle. Kennedy set the page flat, tapped it lightly with his finger. "Those are your words, Congressman. The same law you claim I misunderstand. If oversight is Congress's solemn duty, then why did you fight subpoenas when the record didn't suit you?" Schiff shifted again, his jaw clenched, his smile gone. "That's out of context," he began, but the interruption fell flat. Kennedy didn't let him escape. "Context doesn't change authorship. You wrote it, you spoke it, you put it into the record. If it condemns me, Congressman, then it condemns you first." The audience murmured, a low wave rolling through the room. Reporters scratched furiously across their pads, one whispering, "This is the moment." Cameramen zoomed tight on Schiff's face, flushed, rigid, the flicker of uncertainty clear in his eyes. For years, Schiff had wielded words like weapons, building reputations and indictments, with phrases sharp enough to cut headlines. But here, with his own words turned against him, he looked cornered. Not by Kennedy's rhetoric, but by his own. One page can make you stumble. A second page can make you fall. Kennedy didn't stop at the first sheet. He let the silence work, let Schiff's unease simmer in the eyes of the press gallery, then reached back into his folder. Another page slid free, this one heavier with annotation, dates circled, passages underlined. "Congressman," Kennedy said, glasses low, voice slow, "you told me oversight is sacred. You told this body that obstructing it undermines the law. But here," he tapped the page with his pen, the sound sharp in the microphone. "Here is your letter, signed and dated, refusing to comply with oversight requests when they pointed at your own committee." The gallery stirred. Reporters' heads shot up. This wasn't just rhetoric anymore. It was receipts. Kennedy read aloud, word for word. "The committee declines to provide documents at this time, citing confidentiality and institutional integrity." He paused, looked up. "Those are your words, Congressman, written to protect yourself. You claim obstruction undermines the law, yet you wrote this obstruction yourself. Tell me, who's undermining oversight now?" The room reacted, not loudly, not with gasps or boos, but with the subtle, unmistakable shift of posture. Back straightening, brows furrowing, pens scratching harder. The shift of a room that has realized the attack dog has teeth marks on his own leg. Schiff tried to respond, his voice sharper, faster, as though outrunning the paper on the desk. Those refusals were about protecting classified sources, about preventing leaks. Kennedy leaned back, calm as a pond. "And yet, Congressman, you leaked selectively when it served your narrative. Do you deny it? Or shall I read the editorial you gave just days later, quoting information your own letter swore was too sensitive to release?" The silence returned, thicker, heavier. Schiff's mouth opened, closed. He tried to summon indignation, but indignation doesn't work when the evidence is in your handwriting. The cameras didn't cut to Kennedy. They stayed on Schiff, because the story wasn't the question anymore. The story was the flinch. Every room has a turning point. This one arrived not with shouts, but with stares. The pages on Kennedy's desk weren't loud, but they were louder than Schiff's voice. Every time Kennedy flipped a sheet, the air seemed to tilt a little further against the congressman. And now, with two contradictions already exposed, the chamber itself began to lean. Not physically, but perceptibly. The tilt was visible in posture, in silence, in the way heads no longer turned toward Schiff when he spoke, but toward Kennedy when he stopped speaking. Schiff tried to reassert himself, his voice tightening as he rattled off procedure, intent, justification. "The letter you're citing was in defense of sensitive national security information," he said, raising his hand slightly, as if scolding a misinformed student. "It is dishonest to suggest that protecting intelligence sources is the same thing as obstruction." The words sounded polished, but they bounced hollow against the moment, because Kennedy didn't rush to respond. He didn't even lift his head right away. He let Schiff's argument hang, let it echo into nothing, and then he calmly raised the second page again. "Congressman," Kennedy said, "you may call it protection, but here," he tapped the top corner, "is your public interview 3 days later, where you quoted the very intelligence you claimed was too sensitive to release. Which was it? Too sensitive to share, or too convenient not to?" The murmurs in the gallery deepened. A reporter's pen scratched across paper. Contradiction laid bare. Audible shift in the room. Staffers on Schiff's side stiffened, their whispers frantic, eyes darting to the cameras they could no longer control. And then came the pivot that broke. Schiff straightened, tried to broaden the frame. "We cannot allow these hearings to devolve into personal attacks. This chamber is about defending democracy, not scoring points with clever gotchas." But it was too late. The chamber had already turned. The moral appeal sounded hollow in a room that had just watched him trip on his own record. The audience wasn't seeing defense anymore. They were seeing survival. Kennedy leaned back, folded the page, and placed it neatly into his folder. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply said, Nobody forced you to write these words, Congressman. Nobody but you. And the room went still again. Not respectful, not neutral, but condemning. Schiff's attempt to outsmart had turned into the chamber's realization. He wasn't the examiner anymore. He was on the stand. When explanations multiply, credibility divides. Adam Schiff had built his reputation on precision, careful words, layered arguments, the appearance of airtight logic. But under Kennedy's slow, deliberate reading of his own record, those layers began to peel. The more he explained, the thinner each defense sounded. He tried volume first. Senator, these documents were cherry-picked. Anyone can splice together quotes and paint a distorted picture. Oversight requires nuance. It requires discretion. But Kennedy only raised his eyebrows, almost amused. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He let Schiff's words roll on until the congressman's own emphasis began to sound like desperation. Then Schiff tried context. Those refusals you cite, they weren't about shielding myself. They were about protecting classified sources. Anyone who's been in these rooms knows that. Kennedy slid the second page forward again. And yet, Congressman, 3 days later, you spoke to the press about those very sources. Not vague descriptions, not generalities. Specific lines you refused to release here, you released there. Which context should we believe? The one under oath or the one on camera? The silence was brutal. Schiff looked around the chamber as though hoping the audience would rescue him. But their faces gave no shelter. Reporters scribbled harder. Staffers shifted uncomfortably. Even his own aides stared down at their papers, unwilling to meet his eye. Finally, Schiff tried indignation. This is an ambush. It's beneath this chamber for one senator to weaponize selective documents against a colleague. Kennedy leaned back, calm, unshaken. Congressman, this is not my weapon. These are your words, your signatures, your contradictions. If they wound, it is because they were loaded before I arrived. The blow landed deeper than a raised voice ever could. Schiff's defenses, volume, context, indignation, had collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. And the chamber, once his fortress, now felt like a courtroom where he was the defendant. Every hearing has a moment meant to be remembered. This one wasn't Schiff's, it was Kennedy's. Kennedy didn't rush. He let the weight of Part 5 settle. The silence after Schiff's defenses collapsed. Then, with the same calm that had carried him all morning, he drew one last sheet from his folder. This one wasn't just another contradiction. It was the kind of passage that ends careers. Congressman, Kennedy said, glasses low, this is from your own committee memo, circulated privately to staff in 2019. It reads, he looked down and began to read in that slow, cutting drawl, we must avoid releasing information that could undermine the narrative of misconduct, regardless of factual context. The words landed like a hammer on marble. A ripple moved through the chamber, staffers whispering, reporters leaning forward, phones already raised. Kennedy didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. He simply placed the page down, slid it across the desk for all to see, and asked, tell me, Congressman, what narrative were you protecting, and how much truth was too much for the American people to handle? The silence was brutal. Schiff tried to respond, lips parted, words forming, but nothing came out fast enough to matter. The camera zoomed tighter, capturing his pause, his tightened jaw, the flash of panic across a man too seasoned to show it, but too cornered to hide it. Reporters' laptops pinged as the sentence raced across the wires. Kennedy reads Schiff memo, avoid releasing info that undermines narrative. In real time, the story leapt beyond the chamber, onto social feeds, into newsroom rundowns, straight into the bloodstream of political America. Kennedy leaned back, folded his hands, and let the silence do the rest, because he knew the passage would echo far longer than anything else said that day. Schiff's attempt to outsmart had collapsed, not under Kennedy's rhetoric, but under his own ink. Some endings don't need volume. They need timing. The gavel hovered. Schiff shuffled his papers as though gathering armor, his lips pressed into a line. He looked ready to try one more defense, one last flourish to claw back credibility. But the room wasn't leaning toward him anymore. It was leaning toward Kennedy, and Kennedy knew it. He adjusted his glasses, leaned slightly toward the mic, and spoke with the calm finality of a man who didn't need another document, another headline, or another word. "Congressman," he said, slow, steady, "you tried to outsmart me with the law. But I didn't bring the law to outsmart you. I brought your own words. And words once spoken don't belong to you anymore. They belong to history, and history won't forget." That was it. No crescendo, no shouting, just the sentence that didn't need repeating. The gavel fell, but the hearing was already over long before. Reporters were typing the closing line as Kennedy walked out, his folder tucked neatly under his arm. Schiff sat frozen, jaw tight, knowing his own words, not Kennedy's, would haunt him the most. By evening, the clip spread across every platform. The OUTSMART attempt trended first. But the cold close, the single steady line, was the one the anchors replayed again and again. One attempt to outsmart, one folder of receipts, one line that ended the performance. Was Kennedy right to trap Schiff with his own words, or was it a step too far? Let me know what you think in the comments. And don't miss our last video. AOC just tried to humiliate Kash Patel. You won't believe she just ended her own career. That showdown had the same silence that speaks louder than applause. It's on your screen now.